I'm Reid Mello. I'm an engineer on the Globus Compute team, and I'm going to talk about multi-user endpoints. So for the interest of time, I'm going to assume that everyone more or less knows the game with single user endpoints. So if there's any questions about that, I'll answer it later. But I'll just kind of get into what the value add for users is for multi-user. So number one, no need to maintain multiple endpoints for different configurations. So a common situation is people had multiple or they needed different configurations, slightly different configurations, maybe different account, et cetera. So you could either go and change the endpoint configuration, restart it, or you could just deploy a bunch of endpoints and just send tasks depending on specific configuration you need. So this kind of removes that requirement, become sort of admin headache, because you can specify configurations at task submission. So I'll get into that in a moment. There's also no need to log into the target computer. So as soon as an admin sets up the multi-user endpoint, it's just a matter of the user submitting tasks to that multi-user endpoint, specifying their configuration, and they're all set. We'll get into the value add for administrators. So there's a lower barrier for users for the reasons I just discussed, and for some reasons that I'll discuss in a moment. We give administrators a templatable, which makes it controllable user endpoint configurations. So again, I'll describe this in a minute, but essentially you create a template that you can specify certain things like Slurm provider and PBS provider that are static. You can enforce limits on maybe the number of cores, maybe nodes, for example. There's a number of different things that people commonly do. And then you can allow certain variables to just be totally user-defined. There's no orphaned user compute endpoints. So again, when you're deploying a whole bunch of different compute endpoints that have different configurations, very common to leave some stray ones. So here you have the multi-user endpoint, which you can really think of as like an endpoint manager. And there's an enforced process tree, idle endpoints, which in this case I'm referring to the user-specific endpoints in user space, are shut down based on a configuration timeout that you can set. And we use standard Globus identity mapping. If you're not familiar with this, I'll cover it briefly. But if you are familiar with this from GCS, then you can actually use the same file. This is a brief overview of the architecture here. So at the top, we have the Globus web services, and here's a multi-user endpoint deployed on an allocation somewhere. So first step, you're running your SDK. So you have your executor, submit some tasks. You're going to provide the endpoint ID and the user endpoint configuration. This gets sent up to the web services. The web services, if the user endpoint's not online, will send a start command to the multi-user endpoint. So again, you can think of the multi-user endpoint as, again, a manager of endpoint processes. We're really sending down the identity ID of the user that's submitting the endpoint, plus the user endpoint ID. Makes its way to the multi-user endpoint. This is where we do a bunch of things, including the identity mapping to the local user account. We fork the process, draw privileges. We render the template, the config template, exec the process. We now have the user endpoint process. And we send that config over standard in. The user endpoint acts in the same way that you can imagine or you're used to your current single user endpoints working. So we'll launch nodes and receive tasks from the web services as you submit them, and submit results back to web services. The results obviously make their way back to the executor or client, depending on your user. We'll get briefly into installation. So I'm showing here our Debian package, but I think there was some confusion maybe in our documentation that people thought that if you wanted to use multi-user, you couldn't pip install the endpoint, but you can. There's really no difference there. It's just more common because people are typically running the multi-user endpoint as root on administrators downloading this. So we have RPM and dev packages that you can install. And configuring an endpoint is the same process that you're likely used to, except you're adding the -- multi-user flag at the end. So that's going to create the standard configuration file that's for the actual endpoint manager or the multi-user endpoint, and then a number of other files that are specific to multi-user. So the identity mapping, user config template, schema, and then user environment, which I won't cover. I'll cover most of these. So right off the bat, if you were downloading this to your laptop for testing, you could attempt to start the endpoint. Maybe you submit a basic hello world function, and you're going to get an error. The reason is because, again, we're running this as a privileged account. We need to drop privileges to a local user account. So we need to perform identity mapping. the standard example identity mapping file is not, it's technically valid, but it's not going to work. So that's the first thing we have to update. So I'd go to, in this case, I'm running as root. So I go to my Globus Compute config directory, my endpoint, and then there's a file that'll be in there, example identity mapping config. You can change the name of this. You can move this anywhere you want. And then so here I just put an example. I'm not going to get into the details of this because I'll just point you to the GCS identity mapping documentation. But basically, you can have a whole list of different mappings here. An example here is it's a regex just grabbing the username from my uchicago.edu identity. So this is going to look through your entire Globus identity list. And then, I'm just outputting that. I'm using the username as my mapped local user account. So that might not be the pattern that you use. That's a pretty common pattern, but you can also link in GCS, you can link to a script and do all kinds of fancy mappings. So now if I were to start the endpoint, submit it, I'll receive a response back. Again, this is if it's running on my laptop because there's a bunch of defaults in the configuration like local provider, et cetera. So this is kind of the bread and butter of multi-user. So this is the user config template. This is what the admin defines. So again, to reiterate what I said before, I have a number of values here that are static. So the type of provider, the partition, but I'm allowing the user to edit the account ID and a wall time value. And this is just a Jinja template, so you can do things like adding a default. I could have conditional logic, all kinds of things. So yeah, this is a basic example. And then on the user side, this is what it would more or less look like. Get the executor. They're going to specify their variables, their config variables, and add that to the user endpoint config attribute of the executor and submit their function. I'll be quick, sir. So here's a user config schema. This is an optional sort of layer of protection that you can add. So we're going to take whatever values the user sends up, apply this schema to it, and perform validation. So again, as extensible as you want to make this, you can. Restricting access, I'm going to go through this quickly. So we have cloud enforced authentication policies. So if you're familiar with other Globus services, we use authentication policies all over in other Globus parts of the platform. So this is basically the cloud gatekeep submission to the endpoint. You can do domain restrictions. This is where we have some high assurance policies here. We also have endpoint enforced, which using identity mapping, which I probably don't need to explain, you can you just don't map certain user accounts, and that's sort of by definition access control. So here's an authentication policy creation. I can edit it in the web app. I can use the endpoint CLI to do this. And then I would just specify the authentication policy UUID here. Quickly with restricting functions, same thing. This is the multi-user endpoint configuration. So I can add a white list of function UUIDs here. And then this would more or less what it look like as a user. I could submit to a pre-registered function. And in this way, the multi-user endpoint says, okay, anyone who's submitting to this endpoint has to only use these functions. Last thing is we have some packaged sugar here to create a systemd service, which is a common use case. So we create this unit file automatically and then some instructions on how to enable this. And here's our current Globus Compute web app. We have plans. We're talking about a lot of different things to expand this quite a bit. I think that's going to be a lot of this coming year. But at least right now, you can at least see your config template and schema and a few other pieces of information.